This vision was really influenced by how factories or manufacturing happened in the valleys of, say, an Italian family business, of many different elements happening. You know, they're good at that and we're good at that. And could you see a future like that for a maker culture where factories are a cluster of people who are good at things, not doing everything, but they are connected in a way? And maybe could that type of vision happen in West London to kind of complement what East London is doing with digital? That was the premise for the Central Research Laboratory. The pilot is now happening with 11 little startups. Are they manufacturing? They're beginning to do batch in a very early stages, but it is a trial for that vision. So I do think that there will be manufacturing of batch production in makerspaces. I do think makerspaces will be fit for redistributed manufacturing. I also think they should work much closer with bigger manufacturing to know who's good at what.
Asa, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between makerspaces and them being factory floors?
Fortunately, seeing as I'm on the panel, yes. So leaving aside the entertainingly thorny question of what is a makerspace anyway, which I'm sure we could have a lot of fun in not answering. If you flip the question on its head and say, so is manufacturing something that is and can happen more in some makerspaces, then perhaps yes. Certainly, so I'm a very big proponent of Shenzhen in China, which is an absolutely just incredible, creative, wild, it's the world's like manufacturing heartland. And what you see in makerspaces and hackerspaces in Shenzhen is that there is a much more kind of organic, natural coming together of the manufacturing ecosystem and sort of the kind of makers and sort of makerspace and kind of designers and hackers kind of ecosystem. And that's something that I would personally like to see a lot more of happening in the UK.
So we spend quite a lot of time, because we have our innovation hub for the Great Recovery in the Fab Lab in central London, we spend a lot of time encouraging manufacturers and factories actually to come to a Fab Lab and see what's happening, because actually, you know, this, in the same way that we hear about Shenzhen, there's something really exciting that happens in that kind of space in a Venn diagram between the big manufacturers and industry and the small disruptive people that you get at Fab Labs and maker spaces, however you define them. So I think there's two things for me, so which is not really answering the question directly, but the first thing is I think that these kinds of spaces are actually new bedfellows, and so they are new partners with big industry. I think we need both of them. Whether you call them micro-manufacturers, I think they are introducing a new kind of energy into cities as well, which is fascinating from a kind of growth point of view and in new sort of new areas. And on the second side, I mean, when we originally started to talk to Fab Lab, we were talking about with Nat Hunter, who now runs Machines Room and was here with me in the RSA. We were talking about this idea of calling it a fail space, because actually what you need to do is to have areas where people can bring ideas to the table and test it without any kind of implications to happen to business, because you need to have that space where you say, what if this happens? And a lot of businesses are now trying to replicate those spaces within their own business structure. But actually, if you have a space like that where you can learn, where you can fail, when you can prototype, you end up accelerating the R&D process. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to help through the funding of with Innovate UK, with the Great Recovery Project, is to really take some of that risk out. And this is what those spaces can offer. And also that kind of creativity that, you know, big businesses and industry really are desperate for, don't really know how to engage with. And this is a kind of, or not brokered space, but actually a space where people can really sort of let their hair down and do a bit of kind of experimentation, particularly in prototyping, particularly in disruption, I would say.
Tom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I think it's sort of irrelevant as a question in a sense. I think maker spaces are places for convening, places for people to share ideas, to build and try and iterate, and that's not really the purpose of a factory. So I think they fulfill an amazing role in the development of products and ideas. I wouldn't necessarily say at the moment that they are in any way a factory floor. They're definitely a factory of ideas. There's also something around it's a bit like asking if allotments are the future of farming. There's a scale issue there that means that there will always be developments in farming that mean that they will be pushing forward, as well as people in makerspaces or on allotments pushing their thing forward as well. So I think whilst we can develop exciting opportunities within makerspaces, it's something, as Daniel said, that sits alongside innovation development of the wider structure of the manufacturing industry.
So is it more that it's a useful language to speak to government, industry, who are concerned with national GDP and outputs, and the notion that we can make things in this country too, and we're somehow being productive? Is there an agenda in which we can use that language? We're using it as leverage for these spaces to describe a point of view rather than an actual reality.
Can I call that? Yeah. I might have been watching too many Adam Curtis documentaries recently, but I think what ideally would be more important is to be able to shift the language of government rather than try and fall into line with it. So, I mean, that might be an idealistic standpoint, but... Oh, thanks very much.
Oh, it is
that was
like
unexpected.
question time, yes.
Yeah, I can't help thinking that really what we need to be looking is turning systems and structures upside down and showing how to do things a different way, rather than bending our language to try and pull in the funding or the support or whatever it is that we're looking for from government.
But I would be surprised if there's anyone on this panel that hasn't used that as an argument.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, I mean, we've all talked about the future factory at various stages, sometimes hopefully and sometimes cynically, I have to say, because you know that the level of making sometimes is very low, and you're thinking, is this really what we want? And that the type of making that goes on, is that ever going to be good enough for people to have meaningful products, useful products? So there is I think we have to be aware that this is a kind of evolving situation, which, and yes, it would be great to change the language in government. I don't think that's enough. I think we have to develop a joint language that people, it's not change it, it's build it. I think that the idea of issues around iterative prototyping are very valuable to everyone. And on the other hand, children learning to solve problems independently is just as important. These are two very different roles of makerspaces. There are two different makerspaces. These are not the same place. And in that sense, the factory conversation is relevant for the more tech-related, higher-end, pro-maker, and we definitely need to make some progress in that area. Because what do you do when you have an idea and you've done your iterative stage and you want to move on to a level that you don't even know what the word fulfillment is? What happens then? We need spaces, we need professional spaces like that will be part of future factories. On the other hand, we need makerspaces who are nothing like factories, and they are the complete opposite. And this is the big issue, which I think was raised in the morning, and people talk about who is it for. I think that's the key. And if it is going to be a factory, then it has to be a different idea of the relationship between the two cultures that we see within makerspaces, which is the design culture and the tech culture. And we didn't talk a lot about, or we didn't hear about hardware this morning a lot, because that's almost a different culture. And if factories are going to be, then this whole hardware discussion has to be part of the education discussion.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about hardware, because a lot of the time we spend, because the Great Recovery comes from the other end, so the kind of waste level coming out of things, and actually what we're seeing now is it's all well and good if you can you see a lot of industries now dealing with their industrial waste flows out and they're kind of the way that they create this stuff. And actually what's happening now, if you've got a spread of that happening, you've got all these different pockets creating waste streams on their own. So a lot of there's a kind of same conversation about the hardware that you have, or actually the output that you have. And we were just looking at this. So this is some of the PLA waste that comes out of, that sits in the 3D printing box, the kind of, failure 3D printed pieces. This has nowhere to go at the moment. So this is an industrial waste, but we don't see it as an industrial waste. We're sort of seeing it as a kind of, it looks pretty, it's very colourful. Actually is a very valuable material. So if we are going to talk about it as being a factory of the future, or, if these are become factories, we have to think about the whole flow of materials, and we have to think about the hardware, and we have to think about, the input-output sense. But we don't think of it like that because it has no kind of, we're not defining it, and we're not sort of giving these different levels of understanding for each use of these spaces.
Yeah, I think so. One of the one of the reasons that we're here is because sort of makerspaces and the maker movement, whatever that is kind of really sort of picked up in the past few years. But I think anyone that's spent any time in sort of makerspaces knows that some of the best kind of sort of value, the most interesting things that happen are somewhat unexpected. And yes, and quite often, and we do it as well, you translate that into a kind of a narrative of the sort of the unexpected things have value to both the people that are doing this stuff, but also to society in general. So we turn that into an argument that's very much about, sort of to government say, this thing has value, and look at all this amazing stuff that's happening. But if that's, if that's the case, it's kind of one of the things that's interesting about manufacturing is, just like swapping the kind of putting the propeller hat on for a second. It's very much about kind of sort of manufacturing, rather than it sort of being this kind of route to, to producing, to seed-funded startups and new sort of mega companies. It's very much kind of, first of all, actually, really, it just introduces new capabilities and new processes and kind of new ways of sort of doing things, which are actually, just as useful to sort of artists and creatives and the kind of people that hang out in spaces as much as they are, the guy who's got a VC check in his back pocket.
Can I just say one more thing on that? Like, coming back to your point about language and should we be moulding language to suit certain things, like, I think what I was trying to say really was that this, as Daniel said again, is something that is evolving and complicated and very difficult to put a label on, which is probably a good thing. And by its very nature is kind of unfinished, and all the language that we use around stuff is around unfinished. The language that tends to be used in bigger or wider circles is that very much that of something that is finished, and something that we can't talk about until we're comfortable that it's finished and it has a form and a shape. And that is like counterproductive, I think, in this sense. So trying to find, like, if we all agree today that makerspaces are the factory floor of the future, I think we'd be doing ourselves a disservice because they might be something completely different next week. So trying to make sure that people feel comfortable with the idea that things are unfinished and that things are in flux.
So is that the very spirit of, well, the very sort of definition of a factory might be that you come in with this notion of what you want to put through a process and get out knowing that was, and it's either is that thing or isn't.
Yeah.
Or actually we're saying these are spaces where you don't come in knowing what that process might be, and it's the chance that's most exciting about it, and that you don't know what material you may encounter or what professionalism you may encounter, and that these spaces aren't saying you can't come in here because you're not qualified enough. That there's a sort of,
being proud of that and owning that is a very democratising thing. It opens the door to people saying, like, you don't have to know what you're doing. This isn't something that is exclusive. And I think so much language around this stuff, and it's not just makers and the maker movement that it happens in. Obviously, it's omnipresent in the world. But once you start dressing things with fancy language, it means that people are immediately disengaged. And the ridiculous thing about it is that actually what we're talking about on the whole is stuff that we don't know the answer to either. So it's like a double bluff almost. Do you know what I mean?
When we, when Matlab set up back in 2009, we had some very entertaining meetings with the local city council, who are now very big supporters of us. But a lot of the time they were going, I don't get it. So you're going to put a building in it, and you're not going to define any of the things that happen in it. and people are going to come in and interesting stuff's going to come out. We're like, yes, you have to embrace the uncertainty. We're like, yes, but no, we don't get it. And then, a little bit further down the line is kind of more sort of the narrative starts to develop, and, sort of light bulb goes off, and, City Council are really behind what we do. But certainly there's, exactly that kind of the uncertainty.
And I think that's a huge point, because that uncertainty, there isn't the space within insurance policies, for example, to house that uncertainty at the moment. And that means the more we play into defining ourselves and boxing ourselves, like, yes, we could say we are a factory of the future, and an insurance company could develop a policy for that, but it wouldn't cover what we actually do. So there are all these things that, because of the very nature of that language and trying to bend into an existing framework, inhibit our ability to grow in the way that we should be.
So we're an uncertainty factory.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that it's really interesting with the language issue around makerspaces. When we were working on Power of Making in 2010, we wanted to call it makerspace or maker lab, and I was in touch with Neil Gershenfeld, who set up the Fab Labs, and he said it doesn't work in museums. You need a community. So whatever you call it, doesn't matter. And we thought about it, and we appointed some residents, and we created a community that was part of the V&A, and started working, of course, in an exhibition, in a museum. A makerspace is very different. It's not somewhere where people do projects. It's somewhere where people get access first time. And we looked at the names, and we decided to choose Tinkerspace, because it was more local for us, and also it implied a different type of access for a wider diversity, and also different levels. And through that, I learned that I think, for me, any makerspace deals with the relationship between access and confidence. And whatever they do, whether it's for children getting their first touch of the Pi computers or embroidery, or it's for someone who has an innovation idea, they need the confidence to become a startup business, this is the process that we need to look after in there. And in that sense, yes, it could be a factory if that's the confidence, that's the result. But I don't think that we can say that it's one thing.
Any last thoughts on the panel before we open to the floor?
I think we should open to the floor.
Let's get out there.
We could go on and on.
The woman who clapped earlier, she can go first. If you want to, you could say your name and where you come from. No, don't get into what you last made. Just keep it nice and concise.
Hi, I'm Roanne Dodds. I come from Glasgow, where we have a very different approach to cultural policy. So I'm quite curious at the overemphasis on growth as being a kind of key issue for the maker movement, when I kind of understood that the maker movement was about values and self-expression. And I really appreciate what Daniel was saying about this being about the democratization of access to be able to make. In the artistic world, we are always embracing uncertainty. That's what artists do. And the idea that that can be opened up to more and more people is really, really critical. I'm curious, therefore, for the panel, to just talk about what they understand by growth, because growth is not necessarily a bad thing, because you can have growth in aspiration, in intention, in impact, and so on, but not just economic. So I'm particularly interested and curious about placing yourselves in the world of high finance and high growth, as opposed to in the kind of cultural sector, which is much more about values, practice, and community. So I'd just be really interested to hear a bit more about that.
Do you want to hear from anyone more than anyone else?
No.
Right, Tom. We're going to pick on people. I'm going to pick on people then.
Okay, to just initially touch on the growth thing, I think I can only really speak from personal experience on that to a certain degree, but I think we at Makerversity would like people to grow into whatever it is that they want to be. Now, we focus on professional makers, just because you've got to focus on something, right? So that's what we focus on. We also focus on learning, but that's a separate conversation. So I think you're right to pick up on the point of like this idea that scale or death is something to really behold as the only answer. It definitely isn't. And you also made a good point that really community is what drives all of this stuff anyway, and that's the thing that we hold dearest. That's not to say that you can't build communities around very commercial activity. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think the challenge comes when you set a benchmark of a certain type of increase in productivity or output of any kind as the end goal, rather than achieving the best possible outcome, whether that's a physical product or whether that it's you find a way to work that gets you home at 3:30 every day so you can pick your kids up from school. It doesn't really matter, but that should be the focus. Is like, what am I trying to do and how do I do it best? And then where does that go?
I think from our point of view, we see growth as being something which is to do with both parties coming together. So if you're talking about economic model, for instance, we were up in Scotland writing a report about decommissioning of oil rigs, and actually took a group of people who were not just people who worked in that industry, but we had makers there as well, designers, engineers, etc., all together, coming up with ideas about how to increase reuse of all the materials and the pieces and the elements and components of an oil rig. And actually, the kind of feedback we got from that was greater than the parts in the room. So the kind of growth model for us is about actually how do you encourage those financial and those kind of producers and those big businesses together with people who are highly creative, artists, designers, etc., because you will always end up, if it's well convened and if it's really structured, with a much better solution.
Asa, any thoughts on growth?
Yes, I mean, I guess it's for me personally, for Matlab, you frame, for me, it's the thing that's interesting about what happens in Matlab is inevitably it's about people creating things that are of value to themselves. And also, quite often that involves collaborating with other people, and quite often it's also about producing things which are then of wider cultural value and wider social value. For us, we are an independent space. We do also seek funding for specific projects and work with people like the local city council and we've worked with a whole bunch of different stakeholders. And some of those stakeholders that we talk to are much comfortable looking at things in terms of sort of like real growth in that sense. And so, for us, it's about recasting the things which matter to us in a light that then goes, look, this stuff has value for you as well. So, in that sense, yes, that's why we talk about growth in that instance.
Yeah. I think taking growth from two different perspectives. One is being involved with the British Council setting up the Maker Library Network in the last 2 years. It's a series of makerspaces or add-ons to makerspaces that offer a cultural critical debate within makerspaces. The Maker Library Network is very much about a growth of a connected peer learning environment. So the growth here is in the world that you are part of. It's a young project, and there are 16 maker libraries, but it's bringing peer learning, which I've seen do wonders when teaching in a university, to a decentralized network. It's also bringing in mentorship, which is see how other people have grown their businesses or their practice. And in that sense, that type of growth is more on the, I guess, as a cultural production, but also beginning to talk about civic engagement. So the growth of makerspaces, I think, within that arena can be, we're really right at the beginning of that. When looking from a perspective of the Central Research Lab, and we're really focused on hardware there, tangible things, the things that all the Internet of Things need. We want them to be just as good. And in that sense, hardware is difficult. It's not the same. It's not fast, high growth like the digital financially. It needs a longer gestation period. However, when you look at what are the biggest successes financially, it's often hardware. So in that sense, the maker environment really supports hardware very well. And I think this iterative process, the ability to fail, to have that as a part of your confidence that you are growing your company and it's not a one go, I think, so in that sense, growth is completely a commercially aligned aspect of the maker culture.
Right, let's have a question from this side. The gentleman at the front was first up.
Yeah, my name is Joe Heavey of Great Green Gooseberry. I just wonder, we're talking about the creation of products. Is it necessary? Are there lots of things that are being created? Are they necessary? And if they are created, then they're obviously going to be using resources as well.
This strikes me as one for Sophie.
Yes, is the answer. Well, I know. Yes, they are going to be using resources. No, they aren't necessary. I had a really interesting. Someone was talking about their 3D printer. Where basically, you put to think about how you could reuse waste. So this PLA waste, and they were saying you put your kind of useless product that you made at the top, and you print a new useless product at the bottom, which I thought was quite damning for their design. Obviously, they're obviously not designing very interesting products, but I think it's really.
Did they make the machine that does that?
Well, I was very excited about that. You know, actually, what you'd end up with. We were effectively saying that the future of colour is actually black because, well, you know, all of this stuff, if you merge it all together, you'll get this kind of grey-black, but that's a whole other discussion. I think it's really interesting. So, I mean, looking at this stuff, for instance, this piece is a prototype of, I don't know what this is, but this would have taken hours and hours, probably like 20 plus hours on the 3D printer to make this. And something happened with it, like the printer, I don't know what happened. So basically, it just went straight into the bin. So it's not just the material that's gone into it, it's actually the energy that went into it as well. So I think we have this whole issue about the technology needs to catch up. We need sort of efficiency in understanding things. I mean, it's a bit of a kind of side route, but I think there is something very interesting about the space where the conversations you could actually have, and we try to have with a lot of the designers and anyone who walks through the door of the Fab Lab at sees the Great Recovery. We're saying, what are you making? Why are you making it? Who's it for? Is it necessary? Can you design something which is more about leasing or servicing, not just go for products? And I think to be able to have that conversation with people is the beginning of something which can actually really change the way they start thinking about things. So that's the opportunity. And actually, we were saying earlier, you know, amazing that you can't do that in a factory. You couldn't go into a factory and say, well, I mean, we have done, but I mean, the conversation is much harder. It's actually, there you are, right at the beginning of that process, that concept process, where, you know, I keep banging on about 80% of the environmental impact is predetermined at design stage because you are speccing the materials you're using, you are working out how you're going to do it, you're talking about you know about your audience, you're working out your unit price. All of that stuff stacks up to being a very crucial point of a design process, and that's the key for us about why we're in these kind of spaces and working in these spaces.
Tom, you're itching to say something about what's the point.
Like just playing devil's advocate a little bit. In one respect, and I am playing devil's advocate rather than like believing what I'm saying in a sense. It's kind of a delight of human evolution that we are able to make things that we don't necessarily need. Like that can be a wonderful thing. There are lots of things that we use every day that we get a lot of delight from that we don't necessarily need. I think the question is more like, how do you go about that process responsibly, and think about the fact that behind every product that you make there is a supply chain, and behind every supply chain there is a person or people. And unless you act responsibly, other human beings, which we don't talk about very often in this, other human beings tend to suffer. And that's what this all boils down to, really. So I think the idea that we can make things that we don't need is glorious, as long as we behave sensibly. And I think we have trouble doing that.
Let's have another question from the gentleman with the orange pen. That was fast.
The first maker and the first maker space in modern times was probably Frankenstein. True, Frankenstein brought together physics, chemistry, and biology to do a bit of making using both organic and inorganic materials. So he was a bit ahead of his time. What lessons can we take from him? Because we certainly would not have wanted him to become a factory.
This feels quite Matlab to me. Asa, things. I've been there. I've seen what goes on.
Yeah, when first time I visited Matlab, there was Arduino and taxidermy.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. So I guess there are some things some really interesting outcomes and possibilities from mixing the kind of world of making with, for instance, the world of synthetic biology and biotechnology and chemistry, and looking at kind of new sort of chemical process and all these sorts of things, which doesn't happen in many spaces but is happening more and more. I'm mindful that I don't want to sort of draw I can imagine the Daily Mail headline now, but sort of drawing the direct analogy between Frankenstein and synthetic biology. But there's a real interesting rise of spaces like biohack spaces, which are exceedingly cool, and we've been doing things at Matlab involving synthetic biology and basic kind of community biotechnology. So, building made a particularly poor quality centrifuge out of a disk drive in the top of a Coke bottle, and a controller for a quadcopter that's particularly brilliant. And that in turn, that was to recreate a centrifuge, which is otherwise, sort of like several hundred quid's worth of hardware. And you can do the same things with things like PCR machines, and sort of quite a lot of expensive lab equipment can be recreated in a makerspace quite easily. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be gained from having sort of the hacker mindset and the sort of maker's mindset sort of embedded in more and more places, and unexpected places as well, not just the kind of makerspaces that we know about and talk about here.
Anyone else anything? We can squeeze in another question, perhaps. Oh yes, this side now. Sorry, pattern going on. I will take one more question after this. But in the spirit of question time, I wanted a kind of comedic one. Maybe we've sort of had it with the Frankenstein, I don't know. Or just really good. So if you have hands up next, it's got to be really good because it's going to be the last one. All right? Right.
My name is Glenn Lewis. I'm a retired professor of industrial design and new to the UK. And being a professor, our school had a lab, which you could term a maker lab if you like, with 3D printers, laser cutters, and all this. And I'm recently married, moved to the UK. I read about your maker labs here. I got quite excited because I enjoy fiddling, I guess you could say, and developing products. And I noticed that some of your maker labs have a prerequisite form, or maybe it's a pre-qualifier to determine your skill level. So my question is there prerequisites, and are there skill sets that are required to gain admissions to your maker labs?
Right, Thomas.
Yeah, I guess it's slightly tricky for us because we're a membership of full-time businesses who work from our space and use our lab. So there is no prerequisite other than that you are doing it full-time. People who join us are inducted on all of the machines, and we have technicians to work with them to learn how to use it. We also do a bunch of stuff with people like the Prince's Trust and other youth organisations to train young people in particular. We opened for 3 months in Selfridge's department store this summer just gone, and had workshops down there with maker businesses making their products, opening that process up to the general public. But I think as a more direct answer to your question, just because making and machinery can exist in a small room now, it still doesn't negate the fact that people need to know how to use it, and not just use the machine, but understand the process of making stuff behind that as well. So there are barriers to entry which we look to drive down as much as possible. And one of the biggest barriers to entry is enthusiasm and commitment, I guess. So there are ways to learn that stuff, but there is time that needs to go into it.
Okay, so what are your barriers to entry?
I think it's a bit, the answer there are places that you can walk in. Black Horse Workshop, South London, Makerspace, you can walk in and start working, Matlab. However, there is an issue of kind of, are you being, I think when you say the prerequisite, filling in a form, or this whole kind of, how do you go into somewhere? How are you greeted, and how you feel about using the stuff? And someone has to take a call if you can use stuff or not. In Kingston, where I'm a professor of design and research, there is a system, the very big, good workshops, and students have different levels of skills, and they wear different aprons, so we know which tools they can work on, which they need technician help. There are different systems. Matlab runs a different system. You probably run a different system. The makerspaces have to kind of learn from each other, and I know that it's frustrating for someone who knows how to use a bandsaw or a spot welder to be told about it, but sometimes it has to happen. So I don't know which makerspace did you go into, and what was your experience there?
I didn't go into it. The form that was offered online was a prerequisite to go there, so I filled it out. And I have experience with 3D printers, a whole range of technology, 3D modeling. I'm no guy who wanted to stay involved. I never got a response. I'm so disappointed.
Well, you're very welcome to walk into any of the ones I mentioned. I'm sure they'll be really happy and privileged to learn from you.
Okay, is anybody brave? Look, you're volunteering to ask the best question of the day. You realise that? You've got enough She loves a challenge. Brilliant.
I love a challenge. Vali Laliotti, I'm a fellow, and I loved also what Sophie said about seeing makerspaces as fail spaces. Running innovation for businesses, I know that making it safe for them to fail and experiment is crucial to make them more innovative. So my question is, how mature are the maker communities to enable that for businesses?
That's a good question. Yeah, you did it, as we said down here. Very good question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to start answering that question. Can someone else answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's, what you want out of a space as a business looks very, very different to what you might want out of it as a hobbyist and individual. There are quite a few spaces that are more tailored towards businesses. So that rather than, I think the narrative has changed in recent years from failure is good to failure is okay, providing you succeed overall. Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few kind of accelerator programs. I guess you probably want to talk to someone like Daniel at Central Research Lab, like some of the startup accelerators like Hacks and Higgs Hub based over in Shenzhen as well, that are kind of very much about sort of much more kind of maker spaces that are tailored specifically to business. But yeah, I mean, some maker spaces in general, like sort of like Matlab, for instance, is very, very different again. Is it the right environment for businesses?
Is it not about attitude? It's about attitude, I think, actually, because a lot of the businesses that we work with, I think you get very much a kind of open, up for the challenge response from the designers and from the makers, but actually from the businesses, they're much more cautious, and whole things kick in like IP and stuff like that. And you're like, actually, you've got to leave that stuff at the door. If you want to, if you really want to push it out and really fail and disrupt and learn and iterate and all that kind of stuff, you can't come in with your business hat on. It has to be. It's a mindset coming the other way.
I think that's a really important thing. Like, rather than the question being, are there places and are there makers who are mature enough to support business, it's are there big businesses that are mature enough to accept failure in a public setting and to share as well? Because if you can do both of those things, you can move very quickly.
I think, just to say, if you're talking about maker movement or maker spaces, it's a very different question. If you're talking about the maker movement, the answer is no, because it has to grow up, and making has to have purpose. Making with a purpose is the next big leap that the maker movement or whatever, actually, we can end on that question, and because it's an umbrella for a lot of different groups that have different objectives and different targets, but they share a process. If you're asking about, is the maker culture mature enough, it's older than corporations. Maker culture, the ability to make the most of what you have. If corporate companies want to learn that, they can go into maker spaces and talk to makers. If they want to learn about the attitude of, it didn't work, so what do I learn from it, and how do I keep going, or do I dump it? And this, I'm actually quite upset by the fact that you're upset that someone messed up something.
No,
you
I'm
know,
just like...
that's the most important thing, you know?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but actually I don't appreciate that.
But this ability to embrace the messiness of our contemporary era is something that definitely the maker culture has been good at since forever.
Well, someone's upset that someone's upset. I think it's been a good panel. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you, panel, for your opinions. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Zoe, for an excellent chairing there and lots of laughs as well, which I always enjoy. There is tea downstairs. We're now having a networking break because we also have an exhibition, so you can start playing with some of this stuff. And I do encourage you to go and have a look at Sophie's exhibition, which is at the bottom of the stairwell here. So we're not coming back here until 3:45, but because we do take a little bit of time actually getting into our seats, can you try and come back here for 3:40? So see you back at 3:40. Thank you.